Welcome to the Redcaps Podcast, a podcast where we dip our caps into the blood of our listeners and we ramble on about old school games. In today's episode, I am sitting down for a discussion with one of the founding fathers of the OSR, Matt Finch. As you know, no mortal can outrun a Redcap, so I hope you can sit back, listen, and enjoy. Matt Finch should require almost no introduction to anybody who is interested in the OSR. The old school primer, Osric, Sword and Wizardry, and many, many other products all bear his name. Matt Finch has helped shape and mold this niche part of the hobby that we all enjoy so much. Currently, as we sit down and have a discussion, Matt is working through a little bit of COVID, but you'd really never know it given how engaged and friendly he is through the entire discussion. I hope everybody enjoys hearing his views on all the items that we talk about, as well as hearing some of the insights into what is coming down the pipe for Matt Finch and his new company. As a friendly reminder, you now only have a few short days to get yourself entered into the Child Hero Contest. It wraps up on Friday, folks. Get your entries in. It only takes a few moments. All the details on how to do so are down in the description of the episode, and you can win some really great prizes. So I'd really, really love it if you're able to go in, drop an entry in. All right, let's get to the interview. All right, folks, I am joined by a gentleman who, if there was a Mount Rushmore of OSR games, he has at least two of them that he has author credits sitting on. Matt Finch, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So as I was saying, Mount Rushmore of OSR games, I look at that and I say, you've got Basic Fantasy RPG, you've got Osric, you've got Sword and Wizardry, and you got Labyrinth Lord. Those have to be the first four big names that go up on that Mount Rushmore. But you've done so much more than either of those two games. With Tome of Adventure Design, which I love, the Quick Primer, which I think everybody that has anything to do with OSR or old school gaming should read if they have not. And then my favorite monster book of all time, and I've got a lot of monster books, but my favorite monster book of all time is Monstrosities, partly because I think I could defend my home with it, and partly because
throwing it down from the articulations down to the,
and partly because of the way it's laid out and the cool monsters are in it. And it's got a really interesting take on the Redcap, which is always fun for me. But of all these products and all the adventures that you've written for each of the games, is there one that you hang your hat on as like, this is, if you had to pick one thing that this is going to be my legacy of what it is, what is your favorite product of all the ones that you've created?
Tome of Adventure Design, I think. Just because it's something, I don't think anybody had ever really done a soup to nuts book of tables. I mean, obviously everyone's been doing tables since the beginning of time in terms of RPGs, but that was one that I was just very proud of as being something that was, it has a lot of history for me because it was stuff that I had really started on, many, many years ago, loose leaf pages in a binder, that I would go back to, with half finished tables, and putting all of that together is probably the thing that I'm the most proud of. Although I think, the most useful to people is probably Swords and Wizardry, but what you're proud of and what you've done that's the most useful, they're not always exactly the same thing, really.
Yeah, and Tome of Adventure Design just recently finished up a Kickstarter and a republishing and coming out all brand new fancy look to it from what I saw.
Yes, and in fact, and now I should tell people, I'm able to see Kevin on camera, and I don't have a copy of the new book, but I do actually have a couple of the advanced copies here at the house. So I maybe I'll show you what it looks like, but it's pretty cool. It's got a matte cover, so it's that really sort of cool feeling surface that you get when something's not glossy. It's almost like leather, but it's not at all like leather, but it's kind of like it. And then it's got a spot UV gloss over the letters and part of the symbol, which makes those glossy and shine. So if you tilt the book sideways a little bit, you see the glare and the shine and the glow off of the golden lettering on it. So it's a very, very nice thing, because of course your biggest fear when you publish something is that what arrives from the printer is going to have half of the pages upside down bound into it or something like that. And there's stuff that you can't even really catch in a proof until you actually get it and find out that they actually manufactured the things correctly. And so yes, it turned out okay. So I'm really, really pleased about that.
It's really cool how
if with the products that have come out recently, there's a strong move to, besides the content being really good, the content has steadily gotten better, or I guess that's subjective, but the construction of the books, with a lot of these self-titled, self-published books, or publishers on a smaller scale, have become really, really great quality, in terms of like the cover design, the interior layout, paper that's used. When you take some of the modern books and you take it, and I set it next to my AD&D Dungeon Masters guide, which is a fantastic book, but just completely different ball game in terms of the quality of the print and the other. Although, to be honest, that AD&D's DM's book has survived, so it's still there. But
I recently, when we moved from Arizona to Indiana, I actually somehow lost all of my copies of the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, and just now reordered another copy of it because I use that. It's one of my major tools for just opening a book and finding something interesting in it. I think that it's one of the great books of all time, D&D wise, not just because of when it stood, but it actually stands on its own, and has stood the test of time even through changing editions. That is a source of inspiration and ideas. It's still, right up there. I don't think anybody's ever topped that, in terms of a good idea generating book.
Yeah, even if it's not so much the point that he's trying to get across, with the mechanic that he's talking about, sometimes just the way that he speaks in that book, I think.
Absolutely,
is what juices everybody's brain for it.
Gentle reader, I'm talking to you. I'm reaching out, and this is you and I. We're talking right now, and it's a conversation with Gary Gygax. It's really neat. I should mention too, for anybody who's listening, unless it's written all over your intro to it, I have COVID at the moment. So if I get kind of loopy or weird during the course of this, that is an added bonus to listeners based on the fact that you managed to catch me and interview me while I actually had COVID and a fever. And so I may be more interesting or less interesting than normal. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I'm just going to wait till later on in the conversation and try to get you to spill all the secrets of anything new that you're developing, and hope that you're that you're willing to spill them at that point. And we'll skip the part of the interview where the guest has to get up and do jumping jacks and stuff.
Yeah, I already did that in preparation for it.
So. How in tune are you with the rest of the OSR, or things that have come out recently? Like when I spoke with Chris Gonerman recently, he was saying, he's very much involved with his projects and he doesn't get a whole lot of time to look at anything else. And even when he's playing, he goes, I created the games that I like to play. So he goes, I play those. Are you kind of in the same boat where you've got enough on your plate where you don't get a chance to look at the rest of the OSR sphere of games, or is it you kind of keep an eye on the general industry as well?
I don't think anybody can really say that they keep an eye on the whole OSR at this point, just because it's so large now. It's no longer as centralized as it was when it started, and it was just a couple of forum sites. And then even when it started getting onto Google Hangouts, or G+ rather, at that point it started getting large enough that I wasn't able to follow everything that was going on, and it's splintered more and more. And I think a lot of that has to do with social media, that people are, if you're a publisher, or if you want to, even if you just want to talk to people, it means you creating your own site to do that, which isn't necessarily very well interconnected with other sites. So I think everyone has sort of lost the unity that was there in the beginning of feeling like there was any single central place for the community. I probably follow more stuff than what Chris described, because there are a lot of people I like to see what it is that they're doing. Levi Coombs, Glenn Seal. I'll do a list and proceed to forget a whole bunch of people. So I'm going to stop myself from trying to do, a list. James Spahn. There are a lot of people out there, but that's really just because I'm an individual fan of the particular stuff that they do, much more than I'm watching you because you're in the same interest group that I'm in. I think everybody has lost touch with huge parts of the community, just because there's not enough time in the day to really follow what all is going on. There's a lot of really, really cool stuff. Diogo in Brazil is doing some neat stuff. So yeah, there's so I'm a little bit more in touch with it than Chris described, but I think all of us who were there at the very beginning of the OSR tend to be people who do something and then stick with it. That's why we play the old games, is because we didn't move over to third edition in the first place. So we're also likely to be people who then proceed to not follow the rest of the thing that we got started, because we're still continuing to just do the one thing that we enjoyed in the first place. And so you get it started and it all moves on by you like waves rolling by.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. The with all the movement through it, I agree a lot with what you were saying there, because I feel like there's almost been phases to the quote unquote the OSR, and it's become so broad and so big that it's the debate about what it is almost a full-time thing. But
sure, yeah.
Like I look at the phases of whether it was phase 1 was Dragon's Foot and forums like that, and then phase 2 maybe was blogs, and more of that sphere happening. Phase 3 maybe being Google Plus, and that time period taking over. And now we're almost in a period where it's like the Kickstarter and itch.io phase of the OSR, where so many products show up there before they show up anywhere else. Like it's almost like they appear on those sites, and there's less of it being built up and peer reviewed, so to speak, where it's like, hey, look at this cool thing I'm making, and then eventually it becomes a product.
It's much more commodified and much more like products what are coming out now than what was being done in the beginning. And I think you nailed the phases, at least in terms of where the communities were gathering. I think there were also a few internal phases. There was one where everyone was absolutely sure we were going to be able to figure out what old school meant, and that everyone would somehow agree on that decision. And it was kind of funny because at Knights and Knaves, there's suddenly everyone kind of reached agreement, and then we got like super dogmatic, and then everyone got really sick of us being so dogmatic at Knights and Knaves, and so we and then we developed a whole bunch of splinter groups. So it was kind of like, aha, we've reached agreement. Yeah, I don't like being in agreement. Let's argue some more. And then that actually tees up a question. So I reached out to a few folks that also do podcasts and are in some discords and stuff that I'm in, and I mentioned that I was going to have this conversation with you, and if anybody had any questions. And Clerics Wear Ringmail, which is another podcast, reached out to me. He's been doing throughout the month of October. He's going through your primer and taking each of your kind of Zen moments and also sharing a story about his gaming experience and how it relates to those Zen moments. But he told me to ask you specifically, and I'll quote it here so I don't mess up his question. Okay.
Ask Matt, what is old school? Not what OSR is. What is old school? So it's hilarious that you teed that up, because that just makes the question easy to come after.
Well, so the term old school, when I came into it, apparently Hackmaster was using that to describe what they were doing. And that was even before, I would say, the OSR really got going, because I would put the OSR starting at maybe like 2004 thereabouts, and depending on what it is you're talking about with the OSR. But I think that's when Dragon's Foot got founded. It might have been earlier. It might have been 2002. But anyway, so I think Hackmaster used the term old school, but basically it had turned into an insult on places like EN World, where people were saying, oh, the old schoolers, were doing this. And so a lot of us just kind of adopted that term, okay, so we're the old schoolers. We play old school D&D. And so that's where that came about. I think, for one thing, when you're talking about the pre-2000 era, which I would think of as being old school D&D, but even if you look in the 1970s and 1980s, I don't think you can talk about having people did things all kinds of different ways. So historically there is no objective old school. I think there were people who were probably playing highly plot driven, railroaded adventures, for characters that started out heroic, a lot of the things that are considered not to be old school D&D, but there were people playing those, almost from the get-go. I'm certain of it. I don't know, of anybody who's raised their hand and said that's the way we did it, but I'm sure that there were. So I don't think there's any historically objectified old school, but the way that I look at old school is that, you've got one thing that can be definitely identified, which is the fact that these rule systems that we were using were simpler. And they were they're also simpler in a particular way, which is that where they got complex, they still had open-ended results where a DM would interpret what the result of something was going to be. There weren't dictated results for the DM, and so what you have is a person, a human being, who is making a lot of judgment calls about what is going to happen in this fantasy world based on these rules coming out with something. So they're open-ended, they're simple. That tends to support a particular type of play that was also probably the most common type of play that people were doing at the time. And part of that was historical. I mean, a lot of it was like a video game. You count up your experience points and then you level up, and you've got tables that tell you what you're going to run into outside without the DM necessarily having to script any kind of a story. So, it was a lot like a video game in that sense. And it was more like, Galaga than it was like Skyrim. And so, there was that. There was the relatively high lethality of the game. So, if your character died, it's not a big deal. You're using a very simple rule system. So rolling up a new character is not a big hassle. So there you're going to play with, and it's not super tense about, oh my God, what if my character dies? Because it doesn't take very long, to get a new one. And if you're high level, you're going to go get them resurrected anyway. So, as always at high level, that's not such a big deal. So I'm giving a really long and COVID type answer to the question, but that's roughly what I think of as old school. Is the kinds of systems and the kinds of play that are well supported by those systems, that if you like that combination or some parts of that combination, you're at least a little bit old school in terms of the way that you like D&D. And some people will, absolutely love everything about the old school thing, and they're real old school. And there's some people who are like, yeah, but I like to change this and this to get a more fun gaming experience. You're maybe less old school, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it does allow you. And so in my mind, it lets me think of this concept of old school as being something that does have some objective meaning to it, which is that it's the types of rules that support that type of game, or vice versa, the type of game, and using that, whether or not you're using those rules.
Right. So like you said, over time, people have looked at either the original rule sets, or, like I said, the Mount Rushmore of the 4 first OSR games, and spun off of those. So that you've got games that are directly inspired by the originals, but then you've got games that are inspired by like your work and Chris's work and what have you. And so the OSR has grown and changed, and there's been different takes on it over the time. Would you say that, is there any other games that have come out, over the last, say, 15 years or so, that you would add to that same Mount Rushmore? If somebody had a little side of the mountain that they could carve some other games into, would there be other games that you think should be up in that same realm?
Well, I would tell you, I don't look much at new rules systems when they come out, so I'm not really the person to ask that question, because I've seen the covers of lots of the rule systems that have come out, but I have read very few of them. So I'll have to take a pass on answering that, because my answer would, if I say no, there's probably some great stuff out there. It's just that I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, no problem. The when we look at some of those games and we think about how you guys went about your thing, is I see sometimes that with some of the current OSR games that come out, it almost seems like they're playing a little bit fast and loose with the legality of things. I see some folks with the open game license being maybe a little bit looser than you guys were. From what I'm told, the legal side of everything at the beginning was incredibly scrutinized. You guys were incredibly concerned about it and making sure that everybody towed the line and nobody got the 600-pound gorilla lawsuit thrown in their direction. Can you tell me a little bit about like how that, from a legal standpoint, how you guys were looking at things at that time period?
Yeah, no, I mean, Stuart Marshall and I, when we wrote Osric, we absolutely expected to be sued. And that's the reason that I'm only listed in there as the initial author, with Stuart as the main author, because Stuart is in the UK, where you can defend against that sort of lawsuit much better than you can in the United States. The laws for it are different. And so, and you know, because basically one day I just got on with Stuart and I was like, you know, hey, you know what, I'm quitting because I don't want to risk my house. Because we were absolutely convinced that what we were doing was legal, and I think time has, you know, proved that we were correct about that. But the thing about law is that, you know, just because you're right doesn't mean that the other side's not going to sue you for it. And we were really expecting to get sued. So yes, it was much tighter back in the day in terms of the legal attention to detail. I think that a lot of people who are publishing stuff right now are honestly are probably going too far. I think people are very careless right at the moment with their attention to making sure that they're complying with the terms of the OGL. You know, part of that is because there's the DMs Guild out there, which doesn't have any of those rules. You know, you have to be publishing through Drive-Thru RPG and through DMs Guild. But if you are, then you can use any of Wizards' intellectual property that you feel like. And so that, I think, has led a lot of publishers in the community at large who aren't paying close attention to the legalities of the thing to sort of feel like anything goes at this point. And that's not the case. I don't really think that it's going to ever lead to Wizards raining lawsuits down into the OSR, because that probably just wouldn't be advisable for them from a customer standpoint. It's not like they're losing, you know, any money from having this stuff out there. But yes, the level of attention to legal detail at the beginning was way more. We were paying much more attention to that than I think most people are nowadays.
You mentioned you don't think that they're losing any money from it, but it's interesting that at the time, they had Paizo had the PDFs for a short while of some of the older editions, and then it got removed. And now Wizards is, I can go and buy BX or the original OD&D PDFs from Drive-Thru. Do you think if they had embraced that from the get-go, if they had provided the PDFs in some sort of way, would any of this have ever taken place?
I think it would have happened very, very differently, because there wouldn't have been a need for, because I think a lot of people don't realize, you know, when Osric was published, there were no PDFs of the advanced D&D rules out there legally. You were pirating copies of it, and the books were cheap at that point. But now you can look around and see how expensive those books are, and that had already happened with the OD&D books. The Swords and Wizardry was going in there where it was already prohibitively expensive to get physical copies of the books, and there was no legal PDF of the original D&D books. And so, that was the context for it. And so some people are like, well, why did you even do this? Well, that's why, because at that time, there was no sign that Wizards was ever going to release that stuff. And I don't think they would have if it hadn't been for us. If what they had done on day one was to put out PDFs or, then I think that you would have seen a cottage industry in adventures building up, whether or not they had put that into the OGL. I mean, I actually think that their smartest move would have been to do something like what they have done with DM's Guild. Just let people do their own thing, publish their own stuff, use the Wizards IP, but take a piece of it. I think that probably would have been the smartest model in retrospect for them to have done. Although I also think you probably wouldn't have had the same energy behind the OSR movement that you had when it was a little bit questionable legally. People kind of like, sticking it to the man or whatever it is. And I think more energy went into it because of that, I suspect. But I think you would have seen something that was similar quite different in the details of how it emerged.
Yeah, it's interesting because I look at it and I say, for me now, I compulsively buy products when I probably shouldn't. But I've kept saying to myself, I've bought enough rule sets. I've got all the rule sets I need. I don't need to buy any more rule sets. I only want to buy adventures and cool zines with like the Knock magazine or some other ones like that where they're giving DM tips and that sort of thing. But then just the other day, I got a copy of Index Card RPG in my mailbox, and I'm buying more rule sets. But it would be interesting if it was a world where instead of the rule sets being the main driving force, if everybody was focusing more on the adventures and settings and campaign spots. When I was talking with Chris, he mentioned that originally you guys wanted to use retro clone as kind of like the terminology for things, and he said there was some pushback on Dragon's Foot that wasn't. They wanted to use I forget what term he said for the sub forum on there that they designated you guys to. If you guys had a carte blanche, or if you had a carte blanche on what you would have called all these, would you have just called it old school? Would you have still used OSR? Would there have been a different term that you would have used for all these games?
Well, I mean, for Osric and Labyrinth Lord and Swords and Wizardry, I think that the term retro clone is actually quite accurate. Chris is in a slightly different, because what you got to remember about Chris is he was there right at the beginning, at the same time that Stuart and I were working on Osric. Unbeknownst to us, Chris was working on Basic Fantasy Role-Playing Game at the same time.
Yeah.
And so what you had there is two slightly different approaches to the same problem, which was how do you legally get the old games, how do you legally get adventures produced for the old games? And so what Chris did was he hewed more closely to the system reference document, and he also he did a little bit more tweaking than what Stuart and I did with the idea, which is completely legitimate because his goal was to get something that would also be good for introducing new players into that style of game. And when you're trying to introduce new players, you'll tend to either describe things in more modern ways or possibly modernize things, like the way that in Swords and Wizardry, I have the option for the ascending armor class, because that's what makes sense to anybody who started playing in 3rd edition or later, is they've only ever seen ascending armor class. Descending armor class just screws with your head if you've never seen that. So, and so you have two slightly different, vectors in terms of how all of that's going on. So from Chris's perspective, the retro clone aspect was less what he was going for than getting people a playable game that could be introduced to people who were playing for the first time. Whereas with Stuart and I, we were trying to protect Advanced Dungeons and Dragons from disappearing into the ether because of there not being any PDFs and the books becoming expensive. So we were really trying to historically faithfully reproduce exactly as close as possible what we could get to Advanced D&D and still have it be legal. So I have no problem with the idea, with the term of retroclone, but Chris was approaching it with a different and possibly more forward-looking, approach to the thing, given the fact that now Wizards of the Coast, has released PDFs of the old books, but it's too similar, but not exactly identical approaches things. I have no problem with the term retroclone when it's applied to those games, and then I just don't really have a word for the sort of next phase of the OSR, which was taking, okay, so here are our old games, and we've talked about a style and we've talked about a design aesthetic. Hey, how could we still use that design aesthetic and make something that's either faster or more interesting or does what I, want the game to do? And you get this new generation of OSR actual games, all the way through to, into the science fiction like Mothership and things like that. So it's gone along, it's rippled out very, very far. But the original ones, I think retroclone is probably pretty accurate.
So you've gone through a ton of really big projects. Like Osric is got to be a fairly large undertaking, and you've been with Swords and Wizardry and all the other items you've gone through. how do you organize these large projects, or how much has it changed from the beginning to whenever you started working closely with Frog God and what have you? How does the organization of projects work like that, to keep everything in order for what has to be tons of work?
Organization is my I won't even say not a strong point. It is the one thing that I just basically don't even do. Not my strong point. So it varies, but the thing is that I have type 2 bipolar disorder, which is not a very serious in my case, but it does mean that I get surges of energy that can last for a couple of months at a time. And so normally I just brute force something like that based on energy and not sleeping and constantly thinking about something and taking notes and going back to it until I fall down exhausted at the end of the project. Is kind of, that's definitely the way that Osric worked. And it's definitely the way that Swords and Wizardry worked, and pretty much how Tome of Adventure Design worked as well, although that one kind of came in two phases because I had a computer crash midway through that destroyed a lot of what I had, and so I had to go back and reconstruct a lot of Tome of Adventure Design. So that one didn't go by completely on energy. But I'm not. I'm the last person that you should look to for organizational tips on things. Inspiration, I'm real good at. There's Tome of Adventure Design is full of inspiration. Inspiration is my strong point. Organization is my weak point.
Good stuff. Yeah, that I commend you for keep going, because for a book of that size and to get a huge chunk of it done, then lose a computer. Oh, that would be heartbreaking.
Yeah.
In a pseudoscience world or pseudo revisionist history world where maybe D&D did not become the household name, tabletop games were created, D&D was there, but it didn't catch on as the cultural touch point that it was. It didn't become the Kleenex of tabletop role-playing games. Mm-hmm. What do you think would have been, or what would you think would have been a cool alternate game for that timeline to go down that, maybe we'd all be talking about some other game from that era?
Traveler.
Yeah,
Traveler is my other fun go-to on for science fiction type stuff. So
it's always interesting to me. I don't play a lot of science fiction games, and I find it. Do you have a theory on why fantasy seems to be the dominant role-playing game system or role-playing game genre over, say, sci-fi or horror? Those other ones are there, and there is a definite amount of audience for them, but it feels like fantasy just dominates in a way that is total almost.
Yeah, well, I think the problem with science fiction is that people don't have the same. People coming and sitting down at the table may have slightly different mental images of what technology is capable of doing, whereas everyone knows what a sword can do, or they think they do. Whereas you don't quite have. It's not quite as easily grasped what it is that you can do, what are your capabilities in a science fiction type world. And I think the problem with horror is that it is harder to DM a horror game, I suspect. I find it harder to do. And also, probably because, one person's horror is another person's, oh my God, trigger warnings sort of thing. So, I think it's different problems with the other genres that are out there. Fantasy just hits the easiest. It's the easiest to get a group of random strangers to sit together and be able to envision a world without arguing with each other about details if you're using a fantasy world than it is any other one.
Yeah, I think just because there's more of a cultural understanding, common understanding of what that looks like, I guess, it's just in their theater of the mind, so to speak.
Yeah, because other than magic, it's all basically, it's already been there.
Right. I was having a conversation with some folks yesterday on a different podcast, and we were just talking about, again, kind of like genre and how you nail OSR down to something. And I just thought of it here now that it'd be interesting to ask you this, because you've worked on products that span everything from OSR products all the way up to modern games with Pathfinder and 5e that we've worked in some way with products in that sense. Mm-hmm. the name tag that you see commonly going out. So if you see a Powered by the Apocalypse game, if you see that on a cover of a book, you understand what that rule set is. If you see something down in the bottom corner that says 5e compatible, using that as a way to avoid Wizards trademark, just say 5e compatible, people generally understand that. When you see the OSR logo on a book, sometimes you can understand what that is. Is there a trademark that could be done to kind of start to, does there need to be a different naming convention so people, when they see the OSR label on a book, they could understand what it is? Like, do you have to subdivide this more, or how does somebody get to that understanding of what it is? Does it have to be like, this is a fantasy genre in a 1979 rule set?
But well, that's one of the things about the OSR expanding, is that originally we were talking only about D&D, and you knew that because we were on D&D forums, and there weren't other people, or you weren't in the traveler section of that forum. So when people were talking about old school, you knew that we were specifically talking about D&D. I know chivalry and sorcery is different. That's not what we're talking about. And yes, chivalry and sorcery absolutely existed back then, but it's not what we're talking about. Yes, now that OSR has started to be approached as an overall philosophy of generally rules light gaming, and so again, something like Mothership, that's sci-fi, or Hulks and Horrors, to get one that's from further back in the day. That's one that was built off of Swords and Wizardry, but for a Warhammer 40K type of universe, Hulks and Horrors. The genre is no longer necessarily specified. Do I think it needs it? I don't know. I mean, I'm not. Branding's a really, really difficult question, and the OSR is not my responsibility to do the branding for the OSR. Thankfully, so I don't know.
Yeah, I worry about it because I think it's difficult for people to figure out what product they're getting at times. I noticed that when we had our discussion on the podcast yesterday about this, we took a look at Drive-Thru, and they listed OSR as a rule set. So it wasn't even listed as a genre; it was listed as a rule set. And it was like, well, that's not even remotely accurate either, because there's so many different rule sets. But I think it's a problem that the community is going to have, just from if people are going to use that label on the cover of their products, right? If they're going to slap that label on there, just because what does it mean? I think will be a big thing. Whereas
I think people who are already familiar with it and in the community don't have any problem with that, because we really do have a whole bunch of sub genres that people talk about. They'll say it's OSR, it's BX. And they'll get more specific, but it's like, but if you're an outsider, it's like when I go to a board game thing and I see people talking about it's a European transactional quasi-metallic counter-driven player powered, and it's this whole series of their specifications that as an only occasional board gamer, I've got no clue what any of those mean. And I'm sure that's what people run into, when they start getting with the OSR. But I'm not sure that you can get, I'm not sure that you can drill it down. I think people just have to sort of ask, what does this BX thing mean? Oh, that's basic expert. That's, blah, blah, blah. It'll work with pretty much any D&D set that was written before the year 2000, but you may have to fudge the numbers if you care, and don't fudge the numbers if you don't care, because it'll still work even if you don't fudge the numbers. So
I get you on the board game thing. I've got a full shelf of them over here, and I constantly have to tell my if I'm introducing games to people, I'm like, okay, this is a Euro game, so it's a little bit just understanding how that goes through. But yeah, the when I mentioned that you've worked on a bunch of projects, a lot of people will know you through, especially with Swords and Wizardry, through Frog God, what have you. But with Tome of Adventure Design, you've moved it over to your own, namespace, your own company that you've got going on, Mythmere. Can you talk a little bit about how that transition happened,
Sure.
And what it's like kind of having, you no longer have the support behind it, as not support from the community, but support of a larger organization, and kind of bringing this into your own realm. Has that been
right? Because as I mentioned, organization is not my strong point. So
exactly.
Deciding that I was going to do it on my own, separate from Frog God, was a big step in that regard. So yeah, it's I don't know what to say. It was, sort of reassembling. We haven't reassembled, the team at this point. It's me and Susie, and I'm doing writing, and Susie does the layout and a lot of the graphic design, and we're working with freelance artists. And a lot of the difficulty, one difficulty you run into is that Kickstarter, you have to have fulfilled, they grandfathered this, but if you're a newer company, you actually need to fulfill your first Kickstarter before you can launch another one. And so I was fairly used to, doing overlapping Kickstarters in terms of the projects, and just, pumping product out. Whereas now it's much more iterative. You produce it, you fulfill it, then you can start a new Kickstarter. So there's, we're just getting to the point where we're fulfilling the Tome Adventure Design Kickstarter. The books are in the warehouse. They're going to be shipping them out in early November. Don't know when this will actually air for people, but early November is when those are going to go out. And so probably roughly around November, we will start talking about our next Kickstarter, which is going to be City Encounters. What we're also going to do, we're going to be coming out with a print on. So Swords and Wizardry Complete. Here's what the plans are for Swords and Wizardry Complete. This is where you lure me into beginning to babble about all this.
Plan is working.
Yeah, it's working perfectly. Shh, don't tell anyone. All right. So we're going to do a single volume book for that. I think people are just about evenly split on whether they like box set with digest size multiple books for Swords and Wizardry, or they like the more convenient I have it all in one volume approach. Seems to be about half and half. From the publisher's perspective, it is way fucking easier to publish a one volume book than it is to put several separately bound books into a box and send that out. So we're gonna lead at least with the one volume set. We're also going to do two different versions of that book. They're identical interior, but we're going to do one that is print on demand, and that'll have one cover, and then and that'll be out first. And that's because international shipping costs are so high that it is way easier for people who are in a country other than the U.S. to use a print on demand service to print their book in the country that they're in and not pay for the shipping, because the shipping is ridiculous at this point, and it doesn't look like it is going to go down as a ratio of how much shipping you're paying, as a fraction of the book. It doesn't look like that's going to go down anytime real soon. So we're going to do a print-on-demand version of it, and we'll lead with that. And then later, after we've done City Encounters, then we'll do a Kickstarter for the more traditionally printed version of the book, and that will allow us to do, a really high-quality binding on the book, that is. And then if it goes into distribution, it'll be books out of that printing that go into distribution. So that's basically the plan for that, and it all depends on getting through the completion of the fulfillment on the first one, and then how fast we're able to fulfill the City Encounters one. But we're usually ahead of the curve of most publishers, in that usually when we go to Kickstarter, I say usually, we've done one, but we have the capability for it, and it's the way that we like to do it, is that we have already done the layout before we even launch the Kickstarter. And that's just what you get from having one of the principals of the company be the layout person. Susie does our layout. And since she does the graphics for the Kickstarter, she likes to pull stuff, from the actual completed layout of the book for doing the Kickstarter graphics. And so the benefit to that is that you are way ahead of the game in terms of fulfillment, because you can just tell the printer, okay, we finished the Kickstarter yesterday, print. And
right.
a lot of places are still doing the layout or still ordering the art, or some are still even writing it. That used to be the way it was done. I think very few people do that actually anymore, but I think some actually run a Kickstarter and then write the book. Whereas we're able to start fulfillment, pretty much right out of the box. So,
and all of these, so as you do the Kickstarter and you release these are all coming in under your guys' company here now, and you'll be able to kind of have these. Is the content changing? I guess that's probably the question for Sword and Wizardry. I know the content hasn't really changed in a long while. Is it going to be? Is there any major rule changes, or is it mostly errata, or is there a new take on Sword and Wizardry altogether?
Well, there's never going to be a new take on Swords and Wizardry, because it's not like I designed the game. It's Gary Gygax's game. I rewrote it in a legal way. But since you ask, and since I'm giving away secrets, here's my list of the things we are changing. These are all relatively minor changes, but I'm definitely adopting the fighter parry rule as being less of an optional thing, because that explains why you would want to be a fighter as opposed to a paladin or a ranger. I've gotten more comfortable with the idea that you can have this ridiculously hard to hit armor class, because fighters really suck with the experience progression. So I'm sort of adopting the fighter parry a little bit more. We're fixing the fighter saving throw, making some adjustments to the monk. The monk is kind of interesting, actually, because what I did with that was you've got an unbeatable character class there with some very high stats required. And what I did was I said, okay, well, here's this monk ability, but you can use it if you've got one of the prerequisites that it used to have. And you can use this one if you've got this. So if you go into your monk character and you've got all of them, then it operates exactly as normal. But if you're short on one of them, what it means is you've got a monk that can do some of the monk stuff really well, and others of it they're not so good at.
That's interesting. I like that.
We're fixing the thief climbing, and I've got a big old list here. Stop me whenever you want to. Fixing the dwarf thief's ability on trap removal and benefit. Trap removal. I adjusted the discussion on why would I play a fighter. See comments about the parry earlier on. So yeah, this one has got more changes to it than any of the prior things. Oh, one big one is that we're using the movement rate in combat is increased up to your standard movement rate. So yeah, there are quite a few medium-sized changes to it, which I think most people would really consider errata. But since we have resisted making any changes to it in the past, because we didn't want to try and sell, here's the brand new and improved second edition of Swords and Wizardry. It's a copy of an earlier game in the first place. But so there are going to be some adjustments to it. None of them particularly. You'll be able to use anything that was written for it in the past will be just as usable with it in the future. Some of the challenge ratings may be off because I fixed the challenge rating to make it a little bit more exponential.
You mentioned earlier about doing it as a single tome or multiple tomes, which I have to assume that was largely driven off of how Old School Essentials took their books and they kind of started with those. Well, I guess no, three little brown books. What am I saying? But anyway,
I mean that's it for most people. Some digest-sized books in a box is absolutely the way that Swords and Wizardry ought to be. Because it's original D&D.
Exactly.
So I mean that makes a lot of sense. But on the other hand, it is really convenient to have just one book that you pull out. If you've ever totally jacked up your digest-sized copy of a book because it gets caught in the backpack when you're pulling it out.
Yeah, I'm a fan of having the larger single tome as well. With the if you have to split it, I don't mind there being a player facing and a DM facing, but I don't want to. I don't like the further split down at this point. If for no other reason than just I'm always worried I'm going to lose a book or something along those lines. But um, with some of those changes, one of the things that's been there since the beginning with Swords and Wizardry, that's as a change that I always find interesting that everybody brings up, and I don't know if I've ever heard you say why, but it's something that I highly agree with, and I keep trying to port into other games. Like I mostly play BX games, but I port the same idea. It's how you've done saving throws and reducing it down to a single saving throw. Is what was your reason for going that route? I'm curious because I want to hear if it's the same as why I adopt your reason for or adopt your method of doing it.
No, mine will be totally different. That was entirely legal because when you're so U.S. copyright law, you cannot copyright a methodology for doing something. However, you can copyright a format for doing something. And so the layout of the saving throw table, when you had highly evocative titles like Dragon's Breath, Turned to Stone, less so magic, but having that, I'm making a little box shape here for that Kevin can see.
Having a table that has those exact
I'm drawing a box with my fingers to indicate that I cannot think of the word table. But having those headers and those numbers, and the numbers match precisely, and the headers are close, but they're not really exactly right. That created some risk of a copyright violation. Now, it's in the book, but it's in the book as the historical, this is how it was done in OD&D. It's not actually a part of the rules, so people can see it there for reference, and they can use it if they want to. But I needed to have a way of doing saving throws that was ironclad, not a derivation from that saving throw table.
Right.
And at the time, because you got to remember the SRD, the system reference document, that was the thing that we were all allowed to legally refer to because it was released under the open gaming license, that did not use tables. It used a different saving throw setup of fortitude save, will save, and some other sort of save, dexterity save. So we didn't have you had no tabular saving throw format that you could legally refer to and create a derivative work from. So that's why it had to be done in some other way. Now, why did I pick a single saving throw? Largely because I knew that what I was working with was working because it was a simple system, and so I did it that way. But it was not done necessarily for, I tried to pick the best method for it in terms of the quality, but the reason that I made that I did that differently was for legal reasons, not for play reasons.
Right. Okay. So you weren't sitting in the seat where I'm at, where I'm like, sometimes the multiple saving throw is so ambiguous that I don't know which one to pick at times. I love the fact that there's just one. That wasn't your goal. It was, again, just a legal copyright.
It was absolutely the primary goal there was purely legal. This is like what I said, we were paying much, much more attention to that kind of thing, back in 2007 than people are nowadays, because people just take it for granted. It's okay to publish stuff using other people's, intellectual property. And anyway.
Yeah. So my reason for reaching out to you, and I've reached out to a whole bunch of creators this month, and talking to them, is we were trying to get voices of, the positive voices from the OSR and get them onto the air, and just have a place where I can point people and go, because I have people come to me and they talk about, they see negative sides of it via social media. So I wanted to have a spot where I could say, here's a whole bunch of interviews with people that you should go listen to that are really, really awesome from this space. And I've been incredibly impressed by and just shocked, to be honest, with how many people were just like, yeah, no problem, like immediately. And so I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me. And one of the things I always end off a conversation with is, you do a lot of interviews with people. And you've been around and seen a lot of things. Surely there is something that I have not asked you, or that somebody else hasn't asked you, that you would really like to tell the public. Is there something I should have asked you, or is there something that if you were running your own interview, what should have been asked of Matt Finch that I didn't do to put out onto the podcast?
I have no idea. I mean, it may be that I've done so many of them that I've been asked, questions over and over again. I don't know. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Now, granted, that may be because I'm still running a fever at this point, and so I don't know what picture's on my wall. It's an Ed Bickford Sea Witch that he sent me a while ago, and then over on that wall I have a what the hell's his name? Henri Rousseau picture of the snake charmer. I don't know.
All right, good stuff. I am going to be speaking in the near future with Dan Proctor. Is there a question I should ask Dan that you think would be interesting? Is there something that I should make sure I ask him about?
No, but make sure he's okay, because he disappeared for a while there, and it was apparently, and I think a lot of people came to him and wanted to buy, Labyrinth Lord, and people were wondering how he was. I'm very excited to see Dan, moving back into the publishing scene, because he's a very, very creative guy. In fact, in terms of rules, I think he's more creative than I am. He really thinks through rules and what their implications are. But he writes a hell of an adventure too. So I'm really interested to see, and I'm professionally curious too as to what he's going to do with Labyrinth Lord, because I think there's the suggestion that there may be a lot of changes to it. And I don't know if that's just the rumor mill operator, or if it's from something that Dan wrote, or what it is. But I'm curious to see what it is that he's going to do with that. But it seems like he's been in a situation a little bit like mine of almost restarting a thing that is going on sort of from scratch. So yeah, I'm very excited to see that Dan's getting back into the the active world of publishing again.
Yeah, I'll definitely pass that along to him. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say thank you for both coming on and talking with me, and also for the products that you've created, because they've created hours and hours and hours of joy for people all over the planet. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me. I hope you feel better soon from COVID.
Oh, me too.
And all the success with the future projects coming up here. I will definitely be keeping an eye out for both the city product and the relaunch of Sword and Wizardry again. Can't wait to see the Kickstarters on those.
Yeah, it's been fun being on the show, and maybe when we do get closer to launching City Encounters, which again the timing is going to depend a little bit on the fulfillment of Tome Adventure Design, but we can get back on and talk a little bit more specifically about City Encounters, because there are some changes to the original version of it that are pretty substantial, and we can have a talk again, and it'll be free publicity, which is always great.
Anytime you'd like to come back on.
I'm on this one, and I don't even need any publicity, because I'm fulfilling my Kickstarter at this point. I'm not launching my Kickstarter. I'm fulfilling it. I don't. Yeah,
this is the publicity to show that he can pull it off, folks. He's fulfilling it right now.
I don't need you, Kevin. I can do this myself.
And on that one, let's close off the podcast. All right, folks, back to future me doing the editing on this.
Thank you very much, Matt, for joining me on the show, and I wish you a speedy recovery from COVID, and that you are able to make Gamehole Con and just have an amazing time there. Everybody, I will list all the links to all the things down in the show notes, and I hope everybody's able to go in and read up on some of the products that have come from the past and are excited about the new stuff that's going to be coming out and being released under the Mythmere label. All right, folks, that wraps up this episode of the Redcaps Podcast. I hope you enjoyed, you learned something, and that you were eager to come back for more. Later on this week, I'm going to sit down with Dan Proctor, Rune Hammer, and Gavin Norman. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me a note and let me know what I should ask them. www.theredcaps.net has all the links to all the ways to contact me, and I would love to hear from you. There is email, there is SpeakPipe, there's a phone number, there's Discord. I might even put up a way that you can send carrier pigeons. Just get in touch. All right, thank you very, very so much for listening, and remember, never let your caps dry out. Stay safe, have fun, we'll talk again soon. Take care.